I suggested previously that Confucianism is not a membership religion. And if you watch this video with Du Wei-ming, you'll see that he says something to that effect as well. But it doesn't mean that Confucianism is not a religion that really engages people on a day-to-day basis. It is a living tradition, and there are a great many people, a lot of them are scholars, because Confucianism, frankly, is a tradition that is very scholarly. A lot of people who study these Confucian texts in great depth and contemplate their meaning deeply, but if it's just that, then they're just scholars, they're just thinkers. It's really trying to take the next step and think about how do you implement that in your life, and how do you use it as a way to try and transform the world. And there are lots of people who are engaged in that. One of the groups that has been around for about a century or so is called New Confucianism, slightly different than Neo-Confucianism, which is about 1,000 years old. So this is a newer version that tries to address contemporary issues such as gender issues and environmental issues and things like that. So it's a newer version of Confucianism, but of course it draws on the entire tradition. It's just reflecting on them in a contemporary light. So if you are interested, you could watch this video. You could watch the whole video. You should watch this section from around 6:52 to 9:55, so just a few minutes. You should definitely watch that. But if you're interested, the whole interview is, I think, quite interesting. So we have New Confucianism. The next thing on the web page here is there's a couple different quotes, and I won't go through the material, but I want you to read them. One is by Mary Pat Fisher, who's the author of our textbook, and the other is by Xinzhong Yao, who is an important contemporary Confucian. And see what they have to say about the particular nature of contemporary Confucianism and why it might be legitimately considered as a religion. One of the things in particular that Xinzhong Yao talks about is humanism. And it's true that Confucianism has always been a very humanistic tradition. Some of you might not know what that is, so let me define that for you, and then you can contemplate that as you try and think about whether Confucianism is a religion. The idea of humanism is that human beings are capable of taking charge of their own destiny. And in the Western tradition, that's usually framed in contrast to God. So, for example, you have a line like, "Man is the measure of all things," and that is intending to imply that in the old world, God used to define meaning for us. God used to be the basis on which we determined right and wrong, good and bad. But now that we are in the modern era, we're capable of doing that for ourselves, with the suggestion perhaps that God doesn't even really exist anyway, that God never really did that for us, but that we are responsible for generating our own values. And certainly the Confucian tradition shares that sense of responsibility for both individually trying to become the ideal human being, a junzi, or even more a sage, a shangren. That's something we all individually must take ownership for, but society as a whole. It's not a tradition that relies much on God or gods to fix things for us in the world. We create our own moral systems, and we have to figure it out as we go along. And so, in that sense, Confucianism is certainly humanistic. But in the West, there was always a very sharp divide between the secular and the sacred. And so when humanism came along, it had to define itself in contrast to the sacred. It had to be a rejection of Christian, primarily, ideas of what the sacred was. But Confucianism never had that kind of divide. Confucianism and Chinese tradition as a whole has always been one that's much more fluid. A sense, for example, that when you die, you just pass into another kind of existence that has a continuity with this one, and the living family maintains a strong, close connection with their deceased ancestors, as if they were somehow fully present here today, at least when we go to the home altar, and you could communicate with them through your home shrine. So that's what is going on in this quote here. I want you to read it carefully and think about it for yourself, but it might be a little hard to understand. What I just said is what it's trying to express, the sense that that in the Chinese tradition there's a greater sense of continuity between the ultimate transcendental dimensions and the human dimensions. And as a result of that, we see a relationship between traditions like Confucianism and Taoism, and then later on Buddhism, that we don't have to think about them as separate religious traditions, and in fact the Chinese never have. They don't have to choose between being one or the other, and most Chinese will participate in all three. This is a good example. It is a temple, and there are a great deal of these kinds of temples, where you have, in this case, you've got Lao Tzu in the middle representing Taoism, you have Confucius, and then you have the Buddha. All three traditions worshipped in one place with the sense that they belong together. And that is in part due to the fact that the Chinese tend to not draw the same kind of boundaries that we do in the West. It's not as much of a dualistic tradition that demands that. In the next lecture on Shinto, I will get into that question from a slightly different perspective. Actually, it's not the next lecture, but the one after that. So look out for that. I'm going to talk about it in the Japanese tradition, and why they also have the same kind of element in their tradition, where people, in that case, are Buddhist and Shinto. But it applies equally to the Chinese. I'm just going to leave that argument for another time. But for now, I want you to just go back and take a look at all of that material, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and get yourself ready for a discussion on the question of whether Confucianism ought to be thought of as a religion or not.